Welcome to Authors Recommend Books, episode... I've lost track. I don't even know what episode
10?
we're on. Yeah, probably like that. Yeah, 10 or 11, something like that. Anyway, I'm Bradley Verdell, writer of Victorian fantasy and steampunk and adventure stories. And with me, again, is Mark Will, poet and author and translator and musician. He wears many hats, literally and also artistically. Today, we're going to do the old switcheroo again. I'm going to recommend something in the fiction department, and Mark is going to recommend nonfiction. We usually do it the other way. Just before I get started, just want to say again, we don't make any money from recommending these books. The books that we recommend, we're not being paid to recommend them or anything like that. Mainly, we hope that if you like our book recommendations and you come to us when you're looking for something to read, that you'll give our books a shot if you haven't already. So, read my books, read Mark's books. The links are all in the description. And leave us a review if you like it. And that's what we hope to get out of doing this channel. Right? Should I say anything else?
Let's get into it.
All right. Mine's going to be kind of short this time. Today I want to recommend, again, from the time period that all my readers and followers will know, Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. This was written by M.R. James. Not Mr. James. M.R. James. I think it's Montag Rhodes is what it stands for. And this guy would be actually right up your alley. Montag Rhodes James was a medievalist scholar at King's College, Cambridge. This book came out in 1904, and it is, well, really it established what is considered the subgenre of horror or ghost stories, called the Antiquarian ghost story, or the Antiquarian horror story. There are 8 stories in this collection, and they follow a kind of familiar pattern. Usually it is a nondescript, I guess, or a kind of faceless protagonist, usually male, usually a scholar of some kind. And they
Sounds sexist.
Yeah. Well, I think he wrote these stories primarily as Christmas Eve ghost stories to share, so they're kind of like, it's kind of like him, he's kind of like saying, I discovered this, but sometimes the protagonist isn't directly like, I did this and I did that, but it's usually the account of a historian, a scholar, an antiquary, who's in the process of doing some research or doing some kind of scholarly work, and they come across a place or an artifact or something from the past that brings supernatural forces to bear. That's the kind of story, and I love it. It's absolutely fantastic. Again, setting very important to me, so if you have this kind of coastal village in Britain, or where something strange happens, or an old manor house, it's got that. I think it's this is kind of like the source of a lot of things that have been copied. When you see something that's so stereotypical, this is where the stereotype started. This is when it was fresh and original. Out of the collection, I think the 2 stories that are absolutely the best are number 13, and my personal favorite is called The Ash Tree. They're so spooky. And you can read the book. I think it's free. I think it's public domain.
Yeah.
But on YouTube, I think you can still find, although it might be, whoever's posted it might be violating copyright, I don't know, but you can find some Christmas ghost stories that are from this collection, read by Christopher Lee, where he's like playing the professor who's at King's College, Cambridge, and his students come over at night, and they're all in his study, and he's telling the ghost story to the students. So it's got the visual of kind of like looking at faces, watching him tell the story, but it's basically just Christopher. I mean, you can listen to it in the car and just get Christopher Lee's amazing voice reading these ghost stories, and he makes it he definitely adds to it. He doesn't take anything away from it. So, there's a lot of history in it as well, of course. A lot of it's just mentioned in passing. You don't need to know the history to get the story, but it's kind of like, one setup is kind of like, in Denmark, traveling scholar stays in an inn. It's the only inn that didn't burn down in the Great Fire of 1726. Therefore, there could be something about this place from before then, which is connected to, witchcraft or other, things.
Right.
That's another thing, is like going back to like medieval times, and witchcraft and fears of devil worship and stuff comes up in these stories, which makes it very creepy and interesting. The last thing I want to say is that one of the parts of the book that, and this is not a spoiler, one of the things that sent chills up my spine as I was reading is there's one story where, in trying to decide what to do about a situation, one of the characters decides to use the trial of sorts, which is where you open a Bible at random, put your finger there randomly, and that's supposed to be the Christian way to find out what to do.
Oh.
And this is there's been strange events happening in connection to a part of the house, and there happens to be a large tree outside the window of this house, and he opens the Bible to Luke 13:7, puts his finger on it and says, "Cut it down." And it's so creepy. He opens the Bible again to a random page, puts his finger on it, Isaiah 13:20, "It shall never be inhabited." And I won't give away the third, but there's a third opening of the Bible and the finger's on it. So there's a lot of it's not explicit horror like a horror movie. It's not about blood and gore. It's about this chill up your spine that some force from the past is still with us in the present.
It's interesting you mentioned this. In pre-Christian times, people used Virgil's Aeneid for the same purpose.
Yeah.
They would, as an oracle or for soothsaying purposes, just open it at random, put your finger on a particular line, and it'll speak to the present situation in some way.
You always have a fortune cookie if you follow this. It's also, I should just say, it's great for people who like the Victorian setting and who like, creepy manor houses. Because you also, one thing I like about it is it does give you a little bit of information about the time period that the protagonist is telling the story, in addition to,
I think I would enjoy this.
Yeah, I think you would. I think you would like M.R. James, and he's got other works besides this, but I think he's primarily famous for these ghost stories. They have a tradition of kind of Christmas Eve ghost stories.
Not to be confused with E.L. James.
No, definitely not to be. That is a very different reading experience. But I'll throw it to you. What's in the nonfiction department? If I say anything else, it'll be spoilers. So.
That was fast.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're still on the Grand Tour.
Yes, we've been to Berlin first, then it was Prague,
yes,
and then it was, let's see, what did we talk about last time? It was Vienna.
Vienna.
So what city are we going to next?
And today, next stop, Paris.
That was on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah.
I should have used the trial of the swords.
Well, when I was in Paris, yeah, you should have.
If Paris was in there.
Would Paris be in the Bible, though?
No.
Yeah. When I was in Paris, I spent a lot of time in cemeteries.
Okay.
Because there are a lot of authors that I admire who are buried there. Okay. So I just went wandering around looking for their graves. That's what I do on my vacations.
Go, yeah. Hang out in the graveyard.
Hang out with the dead. So
and the homeless people that hang out in graveyards. Or maybe that's just where I'm from.
Yeah, I didn't see any of those at the Parisian cemeteries. But anyway, I made a pilgrimage to the grave of Baudelaire, the French poet. Proust, his grave is there in Paris. Oscar Wilde, he has in fact his it's not a, I guess you would say it's a tomb, because it's not just a grave, right, with a tombstone. It's like a complete structure with a sculpture that was designed, but it's encased in glass, because so many people would
Goof
write
around
graffiti on it. Well, but also just they would leave messages and put flowers or bottles of wine or whatever, to the point that it became a problem.
Yeah.
So they had to it was one of the most popular grave sites in Paris. So they had to prevent the public from getting too close and defacing it.
Is Alexander Dumas buried there?
I don't remember seeing his grave, but possibly that may be the case. But I can tell you, Jim Morrison is definitely buried there, and the situation with his grave site is similar to the situation with Oscar Wilde's. You can only get so close. There's a fence around it, right? Because it's such a popular destination, tourist destination. But also Samuel Beckett, I saw his rather modest grave, and the dual grave site of Jean-Paul Sartre. We talked about him. The
Wall.
When I reviewed The Wall. And then his partner, Simone de Beauvoir. They're buried side by side, right? And that's that's also a very popular tourist destination. People leave metro tickets on their gravesite. That's just a tradition that started, soon after they were buried. People leave metro tickets, and people kiss they have lipstick on, and they kiss the what would you call the headstone, yes, the grave marker, right? So you see
seems highly unsanitary, but go on.
It's a beautiful thing, though. You got flowers and metro tickets, and then lips on these headstones. Yes.
I'm suddenly now thinking of all the authors that I have no idea where they're buried, or if they're buried. It was like Jules Verne. Surely his grave would be in France, right?
I don't know his history, but that's possible. I don't remember seeing him, but there are. I mean, at each. I guess I went to two of the major, or maybe it was three. Two or three of the major cemeteries, and there's a map at each one, and it has the names of all the people that you could possibly be looking for. A lot of surprises, writers, artists, politicians, musicians, singers.
Well, the history goes back so far. I mean, Charles Martel is buried in Paris somewhere.
Okay.
That's
I didn't know
way
that.
back,
That's medieval times.
Yeah. But anyway.
So, that was one of the fun things I did in Paris, wander around cemeteries. But then, of course, Joycean that I am, I had to go visit James Joyce's old apartment. And so I found that, and from the apartment, I walked to Shakespeare and Company, just as Joyce himself would have done every day.
Wow.
He would walk from his apartment to Shakespeare and Company, which is, are you familiar with Shakespeare and Company? It's the most famous. It's the most famous indie bookstore in the world.
Okay.
And
I've seen your photos.
Yeah. And actually, that's what I'm talking about today. The book Shakespeare and Company by Sylvia Beach, which I purchased at Shakespeare and Company. So I mean, when I saw that, of course, I had
so meta. I can't handle it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, of course, I had to visit Shakespeare and Company there on the left bank, just along the River Seine, and so I went in, looked around, and I saw this, and I wanted to know the story of Shakespeare and Company. So Sylvia Beach, she is the founder of this bookstore, and she's the author of this nonfiction memoir. It's basically a memoir.
Okay.
And so it's great for anyone interested in the American expat scene in Paris. Between the wars, between World War I and World War II. She knew all of those people: Gertrude Stein, Hemingway, Ezra Pound, Fitzgerald, Dos Passos, Archibald MacLeish, Thornton Wilder, Sherwood Anderson, Juna Barnes, everyone. She knew them all, and that was their hangout. Like everyone
went there.
Everyone that was a writer or wanted to be a writer ended up at Shakespeare and Company. So, and she knew them all and has fascinating stories to tell about everyone. Some of her French friends are also discussed. Gide, famous French novelist, won the Nobel. He was a personal friend of hers. The poet Valéry, the musician Satie. He was a frequent visitor, and I think did concerts there, or for her friends. So a very lively cultural scene there.
It's just like Taipei Writers Group,
That's right.
All the writers in Taiwan
That's right.
will find us at. I'm not going to say where our meetings are, but one day that place is going to be famous.
That's true. That's right. Well, and then I didn't know this, but also some Brits like D.H. Lawrence and Aleister Crowley dropped by because they wanted Sylvia Beach to publish. Well, Lawrence actually asked her to publish Lady Chatterley's Lover because it was banned everywhere,
that's right?
And
that's right.
She had already published. She had already published Joyce's Ulysses, which I'll get into in a minute. And so he thought, well, she is willing to take a chance on a work that
it's cross the water, sell it in Paris.
Right. So, but she refused, and then she was completely disgusted by Aleister Crowley, and would have nothing to do with him. But very interesting anecdotes in this memoir. But of course, the most important thing about the book is her relationship with James Joyce and her publication of his masterpiece, or one of his masterpieces, Ulysses.
Which I've heard a lot about, but still haven't read.
Yeah, well, that is essential reading. You need to get to that at some point. But so the whole story of the publication of Ulysses is here from her perspective. Now, I knew some of this history, but I had not heard her version of it. So for me, as a Joycean,
publisher's perspective, you don't get that.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
Often.
So the background is Joyce was publishing episodes in installments, episodes from Ulysses. He was publishing when he would finish one section, one episode, he would send it to the States to a magazine called Little Review. And so they were publishing these episodes as he completed them. But they were being persecuted by the Society for the Suppression of Vice. And so these puritanical idiots were harassing them, causing lawsuits to be filed against them on the grounds of obscenity. And so Little Review, the editors of Little Review, these two American ladies, were brought to financial ruin because they were constantly defending themselves in court and they even faced like prison time.
Yeah.
Now, in the end, they were not like convicted of crimes, but they were fined, and so the magazine was ruined.
You just turned their life into a nightmare. And
That's right.
Just laid
That's
there.
right. And it was over. And so Joyce was in Paris at this time, hanging out at Sylvia Beach's bookstore, Shakespeare and Company, telling her, "I don't know what to do. I don't think this book is ever going to come out." And Sylvia Beach, timidly asked, "Well, would you let me publish your book?" Knowing nothing about publishing.
Yeah.
She knew nothing about it. So this is, Ulysses is one of the great self-publishing success stories. She is an inspiration to all of us. She founded the world's most famous indie bookstore, and she is perhaps the most successful self-publisher of all time, because she's the one who
self-publishing goes back a lot further than we
of course.
think.
Well, Walt Whitman self-published Leaves of Grass,
Yeah.
and on and on. There are many examples of this. But
you know what I love about Walt Whitman, by the way? True American. Free verse. That is the appropriate form for an American to, basically invent. Free verse. That's what it should be called. Anyway, go on.
Okay. Well, so Shakespeare and Company comes to the rescue.
Yeah.
And she Sylvia Beach very bravely agrees to undertake this project. She didn't know what she was getting into. But, the story of what happens is in here, and it's fascinating. So some fun facts for Joyceans and the general reader. Joyce hated typewriters, and he always wrote by hand with black pencils. So, Ulysses, that massive tome.
Yeah, how long is it?
It's
not as long as
800 pages.
Okay, so it's up there with like War and Peace.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like,
Okay. He wrote it all by hand with black pencils. I don't remember having heard that before, so that was interesting. Also, 1/3 of Ulysses in its completed form was written on the proofs. So he would submit these handwritten pages, and getting those typed and sent to the printer, that was a nightmare in and of itself. But
and he added 33% more.
That's right. Then it would be sent to the printer. It would come back to Joyce. He would look at the proofs. Oh no, we can't have that. So he rewrote 1/3 of it in this really small, almost illegible handwriting. At this point, Joyce was already suffering from bad eyesight and was becoming blind, and so you've got French printers. English is not their native language, right? So French printers are trying to figure out what the hell this Irishman has written in English in this tiny, almost illegible script.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then they try to make a new copy. They send it back to Joyce, and so in the early editions, Joyce, he would look through it, he'd be like, every page had 1 to half a dozen typos. That's the early edition of, the early editions of Ulysses. So it was just a crazy process. Also, as the early editions are being produced, he sends his handwritten manuscripts to various typists. A lot of them quit in disgust. They're like, I can't read this filth, or I can't understand it. What is it? What is he talking about? They quit. They just refuse. Another time, a woman. They found a woman that agreed to type it, but she left the manuscript on a desk, at her home. Her husband picks it up and is appalled. What is this filth? He threw it in the fire, and it was the only copy. So Joyce had to he had to reconstruct it, and the whole process started over. The whole process started over. It went to the printer. It came back with typos. He sent his corrections. It went back and forth. So it was fascinating to read about all of this. Okay, so finally...
It came out of chaos, total chaos.
Yeah.
And now we're like, he probably sat down and typed that up, and it was all by the book, and...
Not at all, not at all.
So if
There's
you're
a
writing
struggle
something
behind
and it's totally going off the wall, then you may be writing a masterpiece.
You're in good company.
Yeah.
Okay, so the book is finally finished, right?
Yeah.
But it's still banned in the U.S. When they tried to send... It was sold in Paris, at this American's bookstore, but when they tried to ship copies of it to the U.S., they were confiscated at the port of New York and not allowed into the country until a judge reversed... There was a famous, I believe, a New York judge that eventually lifted the ban on Ulysses, but that was much later, many years later. So what are they going to do? They can't even, and there were many people that had subscribed. They had contributed to, they were basically subsidizing Joyce and his work.
Yeah.
And so they're like, where's my copy? Yeah. And so they had to figure out how they're going to get the copies, this contraband book, how are they going to get it into the States? Yeah. So Hemingway, who is, a friend of both Joyce and Sylvia Beach, says, give me a day, I'll take care of it. So Hemingway contacts a friend of his in Canada, and this friend smuggled copies of Ulysses across the U.S.-Canada border. He would put, so imagine an 800-page novel. Yeah. He would put it down the front of his pants, and I think he was maybe he was around the Great Lakes or something. He was involved in shipping or something. So when he would cross over, he would have these books, and then he would hand them off to someone. And so it was one at a time. Yeah. And then they're like, we can do better than this. So he put one in the front and one in the back. and so they started doing two at a time. But that is how the original copies of Ulysses entered the U.S. They were smuggled.
Hemingway's pants.
No, Hemingway's friends.
Pants. Okay, sorry.
Who was smuggling them across the U.S.-Canada border. So I definitely didn't know that, and it was hilarious and fascinating. All right, so that's the story.
And it's a good moral to people nowadays who are trying to control speech. This has been done before. It's been tried.
You can't stop it.
This is the thing that I like about history. Is if you read some nonfiction about history or read historical fiction, it's a lot of things that are going on have been tried before. We all know how this ends, when you try to silence...
People don't learn. People don't learn.
Well, you just have to you just have to relearn and relearn. And so now, they're trying to be, like you said, trying to be puritanical, trying to ban things that you don't like. Instead of arguing against what you don't like, trying to ban it, we know that this never worked. So this is very edifying to me to hear this story.
Yeah. Well, Sylvia Beach describes her operation as a one-author publishing business. She devoted her life to James Joyce and his work, and especially Ulysses. Now, of course, after and this is why she refused Lawrence and Crowley and really anyone else. She was happy to sell their books, but she just could not. Joyce was a full-time job. She could not afford or psychologically handle dealing with another author. So she is an unsung hero in the Joycean story. What would he have done without her? Yeah. She really saved him. So it's a beautiful,
worth meditating
story.
On.
Yeah. But anyway, after Ulysses, Joyce developed contacts with other publishers, and so she didn't publish his next masterpiece, which was Finnegan's Wake. She was not involved in that, but she did sell it in her store. And interestingly, after the Nazis occupied Paris, in World War II, a German officer came into her store and
do the accent.
I'll let you do that. Came into her store and he told her he was a Joycean scholar, and he said he would like to purchase Finnegan's Wake, and she said it's not for sale. He said, but I love Joyce. She said, I'm sorry, it's not for sale. And so the Nazi officer got angry. He said, I'm going to come back later today with official paperwork, and we're shutting this store down. And she said, okay. So as soon as he left, she and her associates grabbed all the books in the store, moved them upstairs, painted over the sign, shuttered all the windows, locked the door. So by the time the Nazi officer came back, there was no Shakespeare and Company.
There was no bookstore there. Wow.
It was gone.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's such a great story.
Yeah. And so that was effectively the end of Shakespeare and Company. So the Shakespeare and Company that you can visit today, that was reopened many years later by someone else, an American man, I forget his name, but it's still the same store, and it's the same spirit, some of the same artwork and everything.
She went out on her terms.
But she shut it down. It's like, no, we're not gonna sell this book to you, Mr. Nazi officer. So and then when he threatened her, she just closed shop on her own. So the book ends with the liberation of Paris and the return of Hemingway. Apparently, Hemingway was like leading. He was essentially a journalist at that time, but somehow he was like leading a platoon of soldiers, which was technically a war crime, I think. Like it was totally illegal, but they're like, it's Hemingway, he's a world famous author and Nobel. Well, he hadn't won the Nobel at that point, but they're like,
let him go.
Yeah, and so apparently, he returned, and there was like a reunion because he had gone off, I guess, to Spain and Cuba and Key West and whatever, but he came back to Paris during the liberation, and that's how the book ends. Like there's a reunion between Hemingway and Sylvia Beach, who were great friends. Like she has nothing but good to say about Hemingway. She loved his writing and says he was a great man and great person. I'm not sure everyone agrees with that, but she thought highly of him. And so I'll just close. You can tell I'm excited about this book. I love it.
Yeah, this is right up your alley.
I mean, this is 5 stars. If you're a Joycean, you must read it. But general readers, anyone interested in writing, publishing, Paris, the Lost Generation, fascinating stuff. And as I read, I realized there was a book I needed to add to my Amazon wish list, and that is Juna Barnes' Nightwood. I'm ashamed to say I've never read that. I've always meant to, but this book reminded me I need to put that on the Amazon wish list.
Why did this book remind you?
And read it as soon as possible. Well, she was one of the American expats, and she was
part of the club.
Yeah, she was in their circle. She was a friend of Joyce and an admirer of Joyce, and I think there was mutual admiration. Like Joyce thought she was a great writer herself, and I've never read her, and I've always meant to. So maybe in a future episode coming soon, I'll discuss Juna Barnes' Nightwood.
Okay, great. And I hope since we've got our own little club of writers here in Taipei, I hope I can introduce you to some of the gang at some point. I think actually Hugo Chung is interested in coming on the show. So I'd like to get him. We got a whole bunch of expat writers that Mark and I know.
We're the new lost generation.
Yeah, we're expats from all over the place here in Taipei, and actually a guy that was and still is a member of our group. Jeremy, I should probably put a link to him at some point. He actually won Writers of the Future contest. So yeah, we've got I mean, I don't know how many books we have between us in the group from Taipei Writers Group now. It's a lot.
Oh yeah,
it's a lot. I mean, thanks to JJ Green, there's at least 10 or 12 right there, and then
that's right,
all over the place. But anyway, hope to introduce you to the gang in the future. Hope you enjoyed these recommendations. If you did, please like the video, subscribe. If you're not getting notifications when a new video comes out, that's because you need to click the bell icon on YouTube. There's something that looks like a little bell, and it's not enough to just subscribe. If you want to actually get an alert on YouTube every time a new video is released, you need to sign up for alerts as well as subscribing. So if you, I probably should have mentioned that before. Share this video with all your friends and all your enemies as well.